any particular issues on this one? Okay, any questions about anything we've been covering up till now? Okay, I'll hand out the next homework at the end of class. But today we will be covering our last topic on discrete simulation. So I hope you all noticed the revised calendar that I gave out at last class, so that one did include a change in the lecture plan for today. So there's a topic I was originally not planning on covering this term, but I decided because of some other changes it made sense to try to fit it in now. And that's a topic called discrete event simulation. So discrete event simulation is a little different than some of the other kinds of topics we've talked about in discussing discrete simulations. So it's maybe a bit less mathematical and more focused on algorithms and data structures, but I think it's an important thing to know about if you want to know about how to implement some of the kinds of simulation methods we've seen, how to think about them from an algorithmic perspective. Because this tends to be a very good way of implementing a broad variety of the kinds of models we've seen. So actually often you would think of implementing a continuous time Markov model in terms of the notions we'll be seeing for discrete event simulation. And it allows for a much broader kind of model where we often lose some of the nice mathematical properties we get from a CTMM, for example, but we can still implement more complicated kinds of systems with fewer assumptions about what we're implementing. So some of the things we saw last time in looking at, let's say, molecular evolution are actually very nicely thought of in terms of this discrete event model. We'll be seeing later in the term some examples from biochemical simulation where the same thing applies. And then there are other examples in structural biology and, of course, beyond biology. So I think a nice way to start illustrating this topic is to take a very simple example of a system that we can implement as a CTMM, and then consider how we might generalize that system. So let's imagine that we are looking at a model of a cell. And we're going to assume the cell has certain channel proteins that bring different molecules into the cell or expel those molecules from the cell. And for the moment, I'm going to assume that we've got three kinds of molecules, say an A, B, and C molecule, and there are channels that bring these in, and there are channels that expel the A, B, and C molecules. We'll be interested in simulating this process of molecules going into and out of the cell. So we're going to make some basic assumptions here, and initially what I want to assume is that we're looking at a system that's described as a continuous time Markov model. So what would that imply about the rates at which molecules would enter or leave the cell? Well, it would, for this to be a continuous time Markov model, it has to be the case that whatever change in state we're describing, movements between state are described by exponential random variables. That's a requirement of continuous time Markov models. And so what we would want to do is assume here that we're studying a process where molecules enter and leave the cell at times described by exponential random variables. So I'm going to assume that maybe there is a fixed amount of these molecules or fixed concentration free in solution outside the cell, so that we're going to have a constant rate of entry of the molecules. So A molecules will enter with an exponential rate lambda A plus, and B molecules at a rate lambda B plus, and C at a rate lambda C plus. But then we'll assume that the rate at which they leave the cell is going to depend on the concentration in the cell. So we might say that if we have Na molecules of A, and Nb of B, and Nc of C, then the rate at which A molecules leave would be maybe Na lambda A minus. So if each individual molecule leaves at a rate lambda A minus, then the time until the next of the Na molecule leaves would be Na lambda A minus. And likewise, we'll assume B molecules leave at a rate Nb lambda B minus, and C molecules at a rate Nc lambda C minus. And so is the model clear for everyone?
I'm a little confused on how, what that really means. Like, is it an exponential random variable, the leading ones? Could you write it out like in more more verbose way?
Yeah, well, I think when we get to seeing what this would look like as a continuous time Markov model, it would be clearer.
Okay.
So if we're looking at this and we have a vector of counts of the molecules, we can think of that as the state of a model. So we can say that there is some state 0, 0, 0, where we have 0 of each of these. And then in the continuous time Markov model, we would say that there are some neighbors of this state, and those would be 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, and 0, 0, 1. And we would have rates of transition between these. So we're assuming that molecules always enter with a rate lambda A plus. So we'd have a rate lambda A plus on this edge of the model, lambda B plus here, lambda C plus here. And we'd also have rates at which we move from this state to this state, or this state to this state, and so forth. And in this case, since NA is 1, the rate here would be lambda A minus, the rate here would be lambda B minus, and the rate here would be lambda C minus. And likewise, we could go to more advanced states. So we would have 2, 0, 0, we would have a state 1, 1, 0, and we would have a state 1, 0, 1. And from this state, we would transition at a rate lambda B plus, we have a lambda A plus, a lambda C plus. And if we were going back from here, we would assume that since there are 2 molecules of A that can leave, we would have a reverse rate of 2 lambda A minus. And from here, we could go to here with a rate of lambda B minus, or we could go to here with a rate of lambda A minus. We could lose this A molecule and get to here. And I could keep filling these in, but what you should be able to see is that this is defining a continuous time Markov model. So does that answer your question? Okay, so once we've defined a model like this, let's say we start in state 0, 0, 0. How would we simulate this? What would the process be for simulating the next step of the model? Yeah.
You sample from an exponential random variable, which is something in the terms of those lambdas.
Yeah, so we would look at this state here. We'd consider all the ways of leaving that state. Each of those would have an exponential rate. We would sample an exponential random variable with rate lambda A plus, another one with rate lambda B plus, another one with rate lambda C plus, and then whichever of those gave the shortest time, that would be the thing that we do. We would move at that time, and we'd move to the state corresponding to that time. So that's the basic way we've discussed for simulating continuous time Markov models. And in the general case, we can convert that into pseudocode for how we could simulate this particular model of a cell as follows. We could say that from whatever starting state we're in, so given, let's say, some state, we'll call it Q0, what we would say is that the first thing we're going to do is simulate or sample a set of exponential random variables. So we would have some time, let's call it TA plus, which would be the time when the next A ion enters, and that would be an exponential random variable with rate lambda A plus. And we could say we've got the TB plus, which is exponential with rate lambda B plus, and C plus, so that's exponential with rate lambda C plus. And likewise, if we say our current state has quantities NA and B and C, then we would have TA minus, which is exponential with rate NA lambda A minus, and similarly TB minus, which is exponential with rate NB lambda B minus, and TC minus, which is an exponential with rate NC lambda C minus. So that would be the first step of our simulation, is to get these times that would correspond to all of the possible next events. And we would then say we will find some ET, which would be the minimum of these. So we pick the minimum among TA plus, TB plus, C plus, C minus. And then what we're going to want to do is say if dt is TA minus, or let's start with TA plus. So if dt is TA plus, then we're going to want to change the state to correspond to what should happen with an A plus event. So we're going to want to replace NA and B and C with something else. What should we replace it with? So we're assuming a new A ion or A molecule has entered the cell. So we're going to want Na plus 1 to replace Na, and then likewise we'll have Nb and Nc. So that is how the state is going to change in that event. And we could say the same thing if dt is Ta minus, then we're going to say Na, Nb, Nc gets replaced with Na minus 1, Nb, Nc, and likewise for all of the other kinds. We do the analogous thing. It's B plus or B minus or C plus or C minus. And then we just have one last thing we need to do. We need to say that the time gets updated by dt. So t gets t plus dt. And then we would just go back to step 1 and repeat that cycle. And that's going to give us a simulation of this model of the cell we've described. So does this make sense to everyone? Okay, so that so far is stuff we've already covered in terms of what we would do with a continuous time Markov model representation. But let's propose that we want to change the model a little bit. So I'm going to now assume we've got a cell, we've got these channels for A, B, and C. I'm going to assume that the outgoing channels are exactly as before. So if we have A molecules, they get expelled at some rate, Na, lambda A minus. And I'm going to assume that this is still exponentially distributed. But I'm going to change the assumptions a little bit and say that when a channel takes in a molecule, it needs to rest and recover for a bit before it can take in another molecule. So instead of bringing in molecules with the time distributed as exponential lambda A plus, I'm going to assume it brings them in as exponential lambda A plus some little delta, which represents the recovery time for the channel. And I'm also going to assume that the same thing would happen for a B channel and C channel. It brings molecules in with rate lambda B plus the recovery time, and the C channel brings them in at a rate exponential lambda C plus the recovery time. All right, so we've now modified the model, and this modification is going to break the algorithm we had here. So we can no longer use the algorithm as I've described it. Can anyone tell me what will go wrong if we try to use that algorithm to just plug in these new times where we had the previous ones? Well, the problem is that we've switched to a distribution that lacks a key property of the exponential distribution. So what the exponential has is a property I've mentioned before, that it is memoryless. And what this means is that basically it's okay on each cycle of the loop to simply recompute all of our waiting times. We'll get the same distribution recomputing them as if we had left those times alone and used each one as it came up in the simulation. And if you're using anything other than an exponential distribution, at least any other continuous distribution, you lose that property. So if we go through this loop and we don't pick TC plus, for example, and we come back and resample it, then the new sample we get is no longer going to be distributed according to this. In a sense, it's like you've double counted that weight. You've caused it to wait again when you really didn't want it to. So you have to do something a little more sophisticated if you want to be able to handle a situation like this. I'm going to describe a change in the algorithm that will get it to do the right thing for this extended model. Right, so now what I'm going to say is, let's assume we're given state Q to 0, like before. We'll say that that state is described by the vector in A and B and C, just like before. I'm going to assume for the moment that we're going to start by sampling a set of times. So we get TA plus is now exponential lambda A plus this delta, and likewise TB plus is exponential lambda B plus delta, and same thing TC plus exponential lambda C plus delta. And we'll sample our exit times TA minus, which would be the same as before, exponential NA lambda A minus. TB minus is exponential with rate lambda B minus times NB. And TC minus is exponential with rate NC lambda C minus. So we've sampled all our times just like before. I'm going to say that we will find T, which we will call the minimum of TA plus, TB plus, TC plus, TA minus, TB minus, TC minus. So far, pretty close to before. And then I'm going to modify the algorithm a little bit. So if we have that T is equal to TA plus, then I'm going to say that first of all, we're going to want to make the state change just like we did here. So if TA is TA plus, we're going to want to say NA, NB, and C becomes NA plus 1, NB, and C. We're going to have to recognize that we brought an ion or a molecule in through this channel, so we now need to find when the next ion enters that channel. So I'm going to say that TA plus gets resampled. That is now T plus exponential lambda A plus delta. So we've now picked the time when the next ion is coming through there. And I'm also going to say that since we've changed the number of A molecules in the cell, what we're going to need to do is throw out our TA minus and replace that with T plus exponential UNA times lambda A minus. But then I'm not going to do anything to any of the other times, just going to leave those alone. So in other words, what I'm saying here is we throw out, well, we've used up our TA plus, we get a new TA plus. We throw out our TA minus because that's no longer good since we changed the amount of A's. So we bring in a new TA minus, but then we don't touch anything else. And we would do the same thing if T was TB plus. So if it were TB plus, then we would do the analogous thing. NA, NB, and C gets NA, NB plus 1, C, TB plus gets resampled, TB minus gets resampled, and so forth. And if we were considering, let's say, T equals TA minus, then we would need to do something similar. We would say that NA, NB, and C gets updated, in this case, to NA minus 1. We don't need to change the TA plus event. We still have this channel waiting to bring something in with the right distributions. We don't touch that. We just create a new TA minus event, which is now the current time plus a new thing, sampled exponential with rate NA lambda A minus. And we would do, likewise, the analogous things if it were TB minus, TC minus, or well, I guess those would be all the possible things that could occur. And then at the end of all of these if statements, we're going to do one thing that's kind of subtly different from what we did before. Instead of going back to the beginning, we'll go to step 2. So what we're doing here then is we're picking the minimum time, we're doing some change to the state, we're throwing out some times that we're waiting for us to pick them, picking some new ones, and then going back to finding the minimum. So the key difference here that you should be noticing is, in this case, we picked new times for all of the things that might happen next. In this case, we're picking new times only for a subset of things that might happen next. And the rest of them we're kind of leaving alone as they were before. So does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so what I've described here is an example of a much more general kind of simulation algorithm. And in particular, a simulation algorithm that can handle these more general probability models and basically cover a much broader class of distributions of possible times to state changes than we can get with the continuous time Markov model. So as I mentioned before, this is going to have some nice advantages, although it will also have disadvantages in losing a lot of the nice mathematical properties we get with continuous time Markov models. But the advantages we'll see as we go, and they'll be considerable enough that it's worth being aware of how this kind of technique works. And what I've described here is what I've called discrete event simulation. So are there any questions at this point? Okay, so that's an example of a discrete event simulation. And then to see what this involves, I think it's worth running through a bit of more abstractly what it is we're talking about here. So we can kind of describe a generic discrete event methodology that's encoded for this particular example. And the basis behind discrete event simulation is the notion of an event. And one of the reasons these are useful is that it's very easy to think of them in terms of an object-oriented programming methodology where the event is the key object that we care about. So an event you can kind of think of as each thing that might happen that can change the state of the system. We sometimes actually have events that don't change the state, but we'll ignore that for the moment. And an event you can kind of think of as an object that has certain properties or methods associated with it. So an event, for example, has a time at which it occurs. So each of these events we're considering here would correspond to one molecule either entering or leaving the cell, and each of those would have some time at which it occurs. So we can imagine that if we have some event E, this event would have a method E dot time, let's say, which would be the time at which that event activates. Is this notation familiar to everyone? You guys all know what object-oriented programming is? Okay, so we've got one method. We would also need to recognize that an event does something to the state of the model. So here, the state of the model is this vector NA and B and C, and this event has the effect of increasing NA by 1. This event has the effect of increasing B by 1. This event has the effect of decreasing NA by 1, and so forth. So however we represent the state of the system, we can say that some state S prime is derived by calling a method E.update for the current state S. So in this case, if we have an A plus event, then the method E.update would act on this vector of elements, and the effect it would do would be to increase the first element of the vector, the NA element, by 1. So everyone follow that? And so we would also need to recognize that this would act on vectors of events. So if we have, let's say, a vector of events, let me call that, let's say, event vector E prime gets E dot invalid of an event vector P. So in other words, what this is saying is that if we give the list of current events to one of these events, it should be able to tell us there are certain events that that one made no longer usable. So if we get an A plus event, for example, that one is telling us that because it's changed the number of A molecules, the A minus events are no longer good. So if we had an A minus waiting to occur and we run an A plus event, it tells us this A minus event is no longer relevant. We have to get rid of that. And that's what this method would do. It would tell us that there are some invalid events that we need to get rid of from our list of pending events. And likewise, we would have another method that produces a list of events. And that would be, let's call it e.add. And e.add would be the thing that tells us what new events are created when we activate this event. So when we activate an A plus event, it creates a new A plus event to take its place, and it creates a new A minus event to replace the A minus event it invalidated. So does this make sense to everyone? Okay, so in terms of these things, then, we can kind of come up with a generic discrete event simulation pseudocode, and that would work as follows. So let's call it generic discrete event simulation. And what it's going to consist of is we have some initialization. So we're going to get an initial list of events, of things that are waiting to happen. The question?
Is invalid the same as remove? Is it the same idea?
Well, that's what we'll do with them. So when I'm making a little different from that because there's some cases where you actually don't want to remove them, but basically, usually what you would do when you figure out that an event is invalid is you remove it from the list of pending events. Any other questions? Okay, so we need to come up with an initial event list and an initial state of our system, however we're going to define that. And then what we would do is, as long as we've got some event waiting to happen, so as long as the event list isn't empty, what we're going to say is we get an E, and we'll say that we are deriving this by extracting the minimum time event from the event list. We're going to update the current time in the system to be the time of this event we've just extracted. We're going to update the state of the system to be what we get by allowing that event to act on the current state. We're going to delete a set of events that have become invalid. And we're going to add a new set of events. So E equals E union, E.add. And that then is basically generic discrete event simulation. So we can represent what we did here as an example of this model of generic discrete event simulation, but we can cover a much broader class of phenomena in this same general paradigm. And it's worth knowing that we're generally most interested in these steps. When we get to analysis, we usually kind of ignore the initialization, but we really care about these steps, which are referred to as the event loop in a discrete event simulation. All right, so are there any questions at this point about what I mean by generic discrete event simulation?
How would you initialize the event list for the example of the cell?
Yeah, so the example we had here, essentially the initialization is this step one here. So we can assume the user gave us whatever input starting state we have, or maybe the initialization would be to make each of these 0. But then we're initializing an event list by creating 6 specific events here. So this particular model will always have exactly 6 events waiting to happen, and finding times for those would be our initialization.
So wait, does that never terminate then?
Well, for this particular model, it never terminates. You can have discrete event models where you're not keeping a constant number of events, and it's possible to get to a state where the event list is empty and then your simulation would stop. So we'll see some of that when we get to, let's say, biochemical reaction simulations later on. We'll see examples of that. But if you have irreversible reactions, for example, then you can come up with a model like this where the events are reactions, but eventually you get to a point where there are no more reactions that can occur, and then you stop your simulation at that point. Are there any other questions? Okay, so one of the reasons we represent it this way is that it helps us think about problems in terms of algorithms and data structures. So in particular, that's not something we would care too much about if we're thinking of the model I just represented, where we had, let's say, 3 kinds of molecules and therefore 6 kinds of events waiting to happen at any given time. But let's generalize and say, suppose we have the same model, except we have n molecules, or maybe n is a relatively large number. So we have n molecules, and we then have 2n kinds of events that can be waiting to happen. And what we might be interested in is how efficiently can we run this? So if we want to simulate this for a very long time with large n, we might need to worry about what is the runtime and how can we manage that with respect to n. And it's going to depend on how we make some decisions about the data structures and algorithms that go into these individual steps. So, for example, let's suppose that we are keeping track of our events by storing them in a linear, unsorted array. So we're going to have the first element of the array is always going to be the A plus event, the second one is the A minus event, the third one is the B plus, fourth one is the B minus, and so on for all of our n events. So just run an array that would eventually have 2n elements. Right, so if we do that, then how much time would it take to initialize the model with this representation? Yeah, it's going to require order n time to initialize the model. We can pretty easily see if this is empty. In this case, it'll never be empty. How much time does it take to find the minimum time event if we are storing things this way?
Order of n.
Yeah, it's also going to be order of n. So we just have to go through the entire array and check each one. Once we've picked our minimum time event, this one's easy. That's just order 1. We look up what the time of the event is. So updating, how much time will that take? That's changing the state of the model.
That'd be constant.
Yeah, that's also order 1. We will have to invalidate some events. How much time does that take?
Also constant.
Yes, that one's going to be order 1. And then adding events, how much time will that take?
1.
Yeah, so we are always going to create either 1 or 2 new events, and we know exactly where it goes for each event, so we just put, let's say, 1 or 2 new events in there. But really what we care about is the order of time for the entire event loop. Usually you would assume you're running these things long enough that you kind of amortize away the initialization cost. But what you really care about is how much time in total does it take to get through the event loop. And in this case, this is the term that's going to dominate this. So we need order n time to get through the event loop on each step of the simulation. So does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so that's going to give us one way of thinking about this. And we might be interested in coming up with a more efficient way of doing this. So one thing I could suggest is, suppose instead of storing this in, let's say, a unsorted array, suppose we sorted these by the times of the events. So we're now keeping a sorted array, and we're going to put each event in order of when its time comes up. So we know the minimum time event is here, and then the next one, and the next one, and so forth. What would our time for the first step be then? Yeah, so that would now be order 1. What about the second step? looking up the time is still order 1 once we found the event. It's just constant time to do that. Updating the state is still going to be order 1. What about invalidating an event? Well, this one would end up order n, because we basically no longer know where the event is. We have to search through the list until we find it. It's not keyed on something that would help us find that event, so that's not going to be too helpful. And adding events that also, well, depending on how exactly we represent this, we might be able to do that in, let's say, log n. So we could do a binary search on where the new event should go in the list. So has this helped us asymptotically, switching to a sorted list? No, it's still order n. So let's try another idea. Suppose instead of keeping these in a sorted list, we keep them in a balanced binary tree. Let's say we put the events in a binary heap where they're sorted by their times. So we get, larger values in one direction, smaller in another, but basically we've got a binary tree where these things are sorted by their times. If we do that, how much time does it take to find the minimum time event?
Constant. Or is it heap or is it
Yeah, a heap.
so that'd be
Log in.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, I guess for a heap, generally you would assume it might take, well, I suppose we could say order 1 for that, but yeah, let's say order 1, and this will also be order 1, order 1. What about invalidating events?
No.
What's that? Yeah, so it's going to be log n. And what about adding events? Yeah, also log n. So has this helped us? Yes, in this case, we brought the runtime down for each pass of the loop from order n to order log n. So it matters how we represent this. And in this case, a heap is a good data structure for the problem. That's not guaranteed to be true for every problem. But we can think about what we're trying to do here to figure out what it is what we need to reason about, at least for any arbitrary system, to try to understand what it would take to do this efficiently. So in particular, if we look through these kinds of things, we can see that how we store the events doesn't really affect the time of this step, and it doesn't affect the time of this step. But it does affect the time of this step because we need to be able to do this extract min operation. So that's something we want to do efficiently. And it affects this step because we need to be able to delete events from our event set. And it affects this step because we need to be able to add events to our event set. And we want to be able to do those 3 things efficiently. So can anyone tell me what kind of data structure is defined by these 3 operations?
Priority queue.
Yeah, so these are the things that define a priority queue. And basically what we're doing, as I was going through these options here, is looking at some common kinds of priority queues. So of course there are other ones we can use, other kinds of binary trees. There are more exotic things, like there's what's called the calendar queue, a Fibonacci heap. So lots of ones that we're going to be able to figure out, based on the size of elements in the queue and the number of elements we create and the number we delete, how quickly each of these operations will run, and for any particular problem, reasoning about those 3 factors and how quickly we run those 3 kinds of events is going to tell us how efficiently our event loop runs, and let us go through our options for priority queues and find the ideal one for any particular task we're trying to perform. So does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so there are a lot of implementation details that can come up and be relevant in some applications of these things. So of course it will matter whether we're creating a constant number of events, or order n squared, or whatever on each pass through the loop. there are some tricks that are sometimes relevant that can help us in some of these cases. So one of them, for example, is that we'll often use what's referred to as lazy queuing. And lazy queuing is basically a way of saying that we actually won't perform this step. We'll just keep some extra information that tells us when we've invalidated an event, and then kind of deal with the invalidation when that event comes up in the extract min set. So, for example, we could keep a time that tells us for each ion type when was the last time we changed the number of those ions present, and then if we pull up an event that refers to that ion type, we can compare it against that timer, and we can see if that event should have been invalidated, kind of deal with it after the fact. So that's known as lazy queuing. And sometimes you can show that that will give you a more efficient method than actually going into your data structure and actively deleting those elements. But a lot of those are kinds of tricks that come up in particular applications. Right, so are there any questions about any of this so far? Okay, so that's pretty much the general paradigm. So in the class notes, I give you some extra notes on, let's say, one of these exotic queues, the calendar queue. But by and large, if you've covered a general algorithms class, you've probably seen a lot of priority queues already. You can figure out how much time they need to perform each of these events, and then whatever simulation you're doing, if you can put it in this discrete event format, you can figure out how to analyze the runtime and how to pick the optimal queuing system for that particular that particular number of times you need to call each of these. All right, so I think it's worth going through some examples of other sorts of systems we've seen where we could use this discrete event representation. And one of them actually comes up with the system we had been looking at in the last class, or one of the systems, and that was a coalescent model. So last class we were looking at coalescence. These are a common way in population genetics that people simulate genetic evolution in a population. And you should remember that I had mentioned that one of the tools we use for describing these is that we can think of them as continuous time Markov models. So in a coalescent, you should remember, we have some sample of k individuals that we're trying to generate, and we go backwards in time, sampling times until we coalesce different lineages among these individuals. Until eventually we get back to the most recent common ancestor. And we can think of this as a continuous time Markov model, where at each step of the model, we are sampling exponential random variables. So we would sample an exponential with some rate, k choose 2, and then we would sample another one with a rate, k minus 1 choose 2, and then k minus 2 choose 2, and so forth. And this is something we can represent as a very simple sort of generic version of a discrete event simulator. So what would be the events in this model? Yeah, so each coalescent would correspond to an event. What would be the state of the model? Well, the simplest way to represent it would be just the number k, the number of active lineages at a given point in time. And then we get a pretty trivial model where until k gets to 1, we always have exactly one event waiting to be performed. We remove that event, we sample a new event that does the next coalescence until eventually we get here and we can't create a new coalescence event, and then your simulation ends. And at that point, we would then reverse this. We'd no longer be doing a discrete event simulation. You add mutations as we go forward in time. You could actually represent that adding mutations as you go forward in time as another discrete event simulation. But for the moment, let's just focus on the coalescent version of this. So that's a pretty trivial discrete event model, but there are extensions of the coalescent where it becomes very useful to think about more complicated and sophisticated kinds of models. one example of this we can get to by considering coalescence, where we have what's called population substructure. So population substructure in the simplest version would mean that instead of studying coalescence among a single population of individuals, we're studying coalescence among a few different populations. So, for example, let's suppose we had a population A and a population B and a population C, and we assume that we've got Ka individuals in population A and Kb and B and Kc and C, or in general maybe we just have n different populations. Then we could think of this as a set of coalescent models running in parallel, and then we would say that one of these is going to coalesce, and then maybe a different one coalesces next, and maybe a different one coalesces next, and so forth. And we can keep running this until each of these gets down to the most recent common ancestor. So if we wanted to do that, we could also represent that as a discrete event model. So what would the discrete event model look like in that case? What would be the state, let's say? Oh,
WKs are present in each population.
yeah, so we could say the state of the model would be the vector Ka, Kb, Kc, or if we have n of them, coming up to step n. And what would the events in the model be? Yes, we would have coalescence events. But then these coalescence events would be, in effect, parameterized by the population. So we would have, at any given time, potentially waiting in our event queue, the next coalescence event for population A, the next for population B, and the next for population C. And then if we wanted to implement that as a discrete event model, we could initialize by picking a time for the next A coalescence that's exponential with rate Ka choose 2, time for the next B coalescence that's exponential with rate Kb choose 2, time for the next C coalescence. And then we run through our event loop, and let's say we pull out a Kb event. What happens then? What would we do to the state? Yeah, so Kb would get Kb minus 1. So if we have, let's say, Kb event, Kb gets Kb minus 1. What events would we invalidate? Yeah, usually the event we've just pulled off, we kind of implicitly invalidate. So the other ones we can kind of leave alone. They don't need to be resampled. And then what new events would we create? Yeah, we'd need to create a new Kb event. So we'd pick some time, let's say Kb would be the current time plus some exponential Kb choose 2. And then we could, I guess we probably want to update current time to be the T plus Kb dot time. And then we could do the same thing with any other kind of event, and we get an efficient simulation of this multi-population scenario. Now suppose we want to make this a little more realistic and say that every so often people migrate between populations. So we might say that sometimes we get a swap of a person from population B to population C. So we need to be a little careful how we account for this, because remember that we're going backwards in time here. So I've just drawn as actually someone migrating from population C to population B, but we can assume that there is some let's say, migration rate parameter, beta CB, and then if we're looking at this snapshot in time here, then the rate of migration from C to B would be based on beta CB times the population size after that event occurred. So in other words, KC plus 1, and then we would pick some exponential with that rate, beta CB KC plus 1, and that would be a time distribution to that particular kind of event. So is it clear what I'm proposing here? Okay, so how would that change our discrete event simulation? What do we have to do differently now? We've created a new kind of event. So we now have coalescence events, and a coalescence is parameterized by the population in which we have a coalescence. And we now also have migration events. And a migration event is parameterized by a starting population, which we can call P, and an ending population, which we can call Q. And if we have a migration event from population P to Q, then we've already said that we would want to, well, first we want to update the time. So we would say that whatever event was, we would update the time by the time of that event, which I guess shouldn't be T plus, we just replace it with the time. So we update the current timer to that event time. It's going to act on the state. So what should that do to the state of the system? It's going to say that KP, because we're going backwards in time, gains a person going backwards in time. So a person moving from P to Q in a backward time coalescent corresponds to gaining a person in population P and losing a person in population Q. What events would that invalidate? Well, we've changed the populations, the sizes of the populations of both P and Q. So one of the things it's going to break is the coalescence times for those populations. So we've invalidated coalescence events for populations P and for population Q. So we've got two coalescence events that have become invalid because their waiting times depend on the size of their populations, and those have just changed. What about migration events? Which of those do we need to invalidate?
That'd be for P and Q as well.
Yeah, so we need to change migrations for P and Q, but we actually don't need to change things that end in P or Q. We need to change ones that start in P or Q because those depend on the amounts. So we also invalidate migrations of the form P and, let's say, R, and Q and R for any R of any other population R. And then we'll need to resample events. So basically, we need to resample the migration event from P to Q. And we also need to resample P to R and Q to R. And we need to resample the coalescences we just considered here. So what would be the order of number of events if we had n populations? How much time would we be spending in, let's say, each of these steps here? So for this model, assuming we had n populations, on each pass through our event loop, how much time do we need to spend in the extract min?
In sprint.
Well, it's going to depend on how we implement the event queue, of course. Well, let's say we use a balanced binary tree keyed on the time. Well, it's not order 1 for a balanced binary tree. So yeah, so the balanced tree takes time that's logarithmic with the number of elements in the tree. So how many elements are in the tree?
That's great.
Yeah, so it's n squared elements in the tree. So the amount of time we need for the extract min is order log of n squared, which is the same thing as order log n. And what about deleting? How many events are we deleting? It's going to be order n because these things, there are 2n of these basically. So the delete operations, we're deleting order n things, and how much time does it take to delete each one?
Okay.
Yeah, so in total, we're deleting n things, and each of them takes time log n, so we need order n log n time to implement that step. And what about adding events? How much time do we need for that? Yeah, we're also creating order n things. We need log n time for each of them, so that's also order n log n. So in this case, if we could find a priority queue data structure that maybe did adds and deletes more efficiently, even if it traded off some slower time for extract min, that might be a better choice for this problem, because add and delete are the bottleneck, extract min isn't the bottleneck in this one. So does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so that's an example of how we can use this in a problem we'd seen before. So let me now consider another possible problem that we might be interested in. So let's say that we are looking to simulate a system. In this case, we'll use a more biophysically motivated system. And I want to look at something that it's maybe not obvious can be simulated efficiently as a discrete event problem, but turns out to give, at least for some restricted assumptions on the system, a very efficient algorithm. And that is a particle collision model. So suppose we've got a bunch of particles moving around in a space. So each of these has some vector of movement. And I'm going to assume that this is what's called a hard sphere collision model, which basically means that we're going to assume that a particle just moves in a straight line with a constant velocity until it hits something and then it deflects. So there's kind of some basic physics that if it hits a wall, it deflects with the same incidence angle as the angle it came in. Two particles run into each other, they're going to deflect off of each other, and so forth. And this is a kind of model that we could simulate as a continuum problem. So you could try simulating, let's say, little steps that each of these take, little delta t's, and then figure out when they're about to hit each other and do the physics to adjust them. But this ends up being a system that actually has very nice algorithm for thinking about it as a discrete event problem. And that comes about because essentially, as long as two things aren't colliding, it's completely predictable where anything is at any point in time. So if we knew the time when to figure out where any particle has moved at any point up until that collision time. So that makes for a very fast simulation of this kind of system, where essentially you jump the simulation between these collision events, and then if you need to know what's happening in between them, you can just kind of linearly interpolate between successive collision events. So I want to walk through this as an example of another thing we could represent by discrete event simulation. All right, so let's say we have n particles, and I'm going to assume that we're looking at a two-dimensional system. Let's say we've got x and y dimensions for each particle. So what would be the state we would need to keep track of to simulate this system? Yeah.
Each particle is x and y coordinate.
Yes, we're going to need for each of our particles some xi and yi. We'll actually need something else if we want to simulate this. What else do we need?
Velocity.
Yeah, we'll also need to keep track of the velocity. So let's call that the vector ui vi for any particle. So for each of our n particles, we need to keep track of these four numbers, xi, yi, ui, and vi. Okay, so then what we'll need to consider are the events that can occur in the simulation. So what kinds of events do we need to keep track of? Well, as I mentioned, we'll simulate it by assuming that we jump between collisions. So basically the events we care about are collisions. We care about when anything bumps into anything else. And we're really going to have to consider two different kinds of collision events. One of these is, let's say, particle I collides with a wall. So we've got some boundaries in our simulation, and we'll need to keep track of when one of these particles hits a boundary, because we know it has to deflect off of the boundary when it strikes it. So what we'll want to do is figure out the time at which a particle strikes a boundary. And let's say that our boundaries are at positions x min, x max, y min, and y max. Then what we'll want to be able to do is to say for any particular particle, what is the time t at which it collides with a boundary. And we can figure that out by noting that at least until the next collision, the position of the particle is a linear function of its current position and its current velocity. So in particular, we can say that the position of particle I at some time t is going to be equal to the position of particle I in the x-coordinate at some time t0, say the time of the last time particle I ran into something, plus the x velocity u sub I times t minus t0. So that is going to give us a formula for describing the position of particle I at time t. That will be valid as long as it hasn't collided with anything between time t0 and time t. So we'll just keep track of updating these at the last collision, which we're calling t0, and then we've got a simple formula to figure this out for any subsequent t. And we can say the same thing with respect to its y-coordinate. yi of t is yi of t0, which is the thing we're going to be storing as part of our state, plus vi. Also, you can say that these are at t0. That's what we store for the state, times t minus t0. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So if we want to figure out the event time, the time of the next collision with the wall, what we can basically say is it's the minimum of the times of colliding with any of the four walls in the simulation. So it's going to be the minimum among times t greater than or equal to t0 of, well, basically what we would want to do is say the minimum of the time at which xi of t, this thing, is equal to the value of the left wall, say x min. We actually need to modify that a little bit. So plus r, where r is the particle radius. So it hits the wall one particle radius short of its center reaching the wall position. And we can say the same thing for xi of t being x max minus r, yi of t being y min plus r, or yi of t being y max minus r. So we figure out each of those is just solving a linear system in each case, pick the t that's minimum among those four, and that gives us the time of the next wall collision event. So did everyone follow that? Okay, so that gives us one property of this. we would need to know when that event occurs, what is this doing to the state of the system, and I'm not going to bother working out the physics of that, but let's just say that at that time we replace xi, yi with xi of t from this formula, yi of t from this formula at the time of the event, and then we'll do whatever physics to get ui and vi updated with, however we do that. So that, I'm not writing it down, but basically figuring out what the incident angle was and projecting that off of the wall to get an updated velocity vector. Right, so we now know how to calculate the time of the next wall collision event and what it does to the state. What else do we have to figure out to get a discrete event simulation?
Particle collisions.
We'll get to that in a moment. We have a couple more things we have to figure out for the wall collisions. So one of the things we need to know is if we've implemented this event, so the next event that came up is, let's say, particle I hits the left wall, what other events does that invalidate? So if that event comes up, particle I colliding with the wall, what events are invalidated by that? Well, we've changed the trajectory of particle I, so whatever was waiting to happen to particle I would no longer happen. So it might be that maybe particle I is heading this way and particle J is heading this way, and there's something waiting in the queue for particle I and particle J to collide, but now particle I's hit the wall and bounced away, so that's no longer waiting to happen. So basically this is going to invalidate any other event involving particle I, and in particular it would invalidate collisions of I with any J. So you would need to throw out any other waiting events that referred to particle I, and then that should tell us what new events we need to create. So it's going to create events of collision of I and any J, and we need to create a new event of collision of I with a wall. So we need to rerun this calculation with the new velocity vector for particle I and figure out the next time it hits a wall, as well as the next time it would collide with any other particle. All right, so that's one kind of event. And then we have our collision of particle I and particle J events. So if we want to figure out when a collision of particle I with particle J occurs, how would we find the time at which particle I and particle J should collide? How could we pose that? We've already figured out how to describe between collisions what the position of particle I is at any point in time. And we can do the analogous thing with respect to particle J, so we can more or less assume we have a way of figuring out where I and J are at any time in between their collision events.
You can equate xit to xj and yit to yj.
Yeah, pretty much. So just like with the wall case, we need to be a bit careful because two things will collide when their centers are 2 radii apart. But basically we can pose that by saying that the time will be the time at which xi of t minus yi of t, or xi of t minus xj of t squared plus yi of t minus yj of t squared. So that is the distance between them, or the square distance between them is 2r squared. and basically solve that for t, and that will tell us when those two particles collide. And we would have to update the state when that occurs. And in this case, I'm not going to go through all of the math, but basically we would plug in this time to figure out where they've gone at that point in time. So we would get new xi, yi, xj, and yj by taking the time of the event and plugging that into the formula that tells us where they've moved to at that time. And we would also have to update the velocity vectors, ui, vi, uj, vj. We would then need to figure out which events they invalidate. So which events would be invalidated by this collision? Well, we need to consider that we've now changed the velocity vectors for particles I and j. So we're going to invalidate wall collision of I and wall collision of j. Those will need to be recomputed. And particle collision of I with any k and of j with any k. And then we're going to need to create new events. And we'll end up creating the same set of events. So we'll need to create a new wall collision with I, wall collision with j, and collision of I with every possible k, and j with every possible k. So once we've got that, we've got a list of the events we need to keep track of. And we could then turn this into a discrete event simulation of these particle movements. And basically, at that point, it's pretty much just plugging into the generic discrete event simulation algorithm I told you about. We would need to initialize. And can anyone tell me what initialization would look like for this model? What do we need to initialize? So you can kind of, let's say the user gives you initial particle positions and velocities. What else do you need to do to initialize?
Waiting the radiuses.
Yeah, so let's assume you're given the radii too.
Yeah, velocity.
Yeah, so you need an initial state, but then you need something else to get the simulation started.
The times for each collision.
Yes, you need to run through all of these possible events. So you'd have to consider all of the times when every possible particle might collide with any other possible particle. In general, that's going to be, let's say, order n squared events we have to calculate. And depending on how we represent the priority queue for this, if we used a binary heap again, then we might need order n squared log n time to put all of these into a queue. We would then have our main event loop. So we've got our wall loop. E is empty. We would run through a set of possible events. We would extract a minimum event. And if this were a binary tree queue, how much time would we spend on that? Well, how many things are in the event queue?
N squared.
Yeah, so for a binary tree, extract min is a log n operation in the size of the things in it. So it's order log n squared, which is the same as order log n. And then we would do our, update the time, update the state. Those are order 1. We would need to invalidate events. And how much time would we spend on invalidating events? How many events do we need to invalidate?
N.
Yes, we're going to need to invalidate order n events on each step of this model. if we're using a binary tree to store the event queue, how much time do we need to invalidate those order n events? Yeah, so you need n log n time for that step, and likewise, if we are creating new events or adding new events, we're also going to be creating order n events on each event, so we're going to need order n log n time to implement this. So in general, as with our previous models, the thing that's going to dominate our event queue is going to be this particular pair of operations. So when we order n log n time for each pass through the event queue. Does this make sense to everyone, or each pass through the event loop? So in this case, we can actually do a little better, and this relates to something I mentioned a while back, that sometimes it's actually useful to have events that don't do anything to the state of your system. So actually one trick we can use to speed this up a bit is we can take our simulation of all of these particles and we can throw in some kind of virtual walls. So we'll just put in some sort of extra walls that particles can pass right through inside the simulation. And then we can throw in a kind of extra qualification on our events that will keep track of which box each particle is in. So let's say we break down our space into k boxes here. And we'll make sure that each box is at least twice a particle radius. And that's going to give us a guarantee that a particle has to leave its box before it can collide with any particle that isn't either in the same box or in an adjacent box. So we can, by throwing in these extra boxes, what we can do is create some extra events. So a particle has an event that corresponds to changing its box. But by throwing in these extra events, we can actually improve quite a bit on the time for each pass through the event loop. So let's say we create an event that corresponds to a particle switching from one box to another. Well, suppose we're looking at a particle in this box and we're considering a collision of that particle with this particle in an adjacent box. What would we have to do as we go through this loop? So would that change the time to extract the minimum time event? Well, that wouldn't change. We'd still have order n events at least. We'd need order log n time for this. These would be the same. But invalidating the events could potentially be much faster, and creating new events could be much faster. And the reason is because when we're creating the events, we're only creating events that correspond to collisions of this particle with ones in adjacent boxes. So instead of creating events for all of the order n particles, we're just creating events for a subset of the particles. So if we suppose that we have our particles well mixed, so they're kind of evenly mixed through these different boxes, then we could say that in the general case, instead of needing order n log n time here, we would need order n over k log n over k time, because we're only trying to collide our particle with n over k other particles instead of n other particles. And if we're a little clever here and we pick k is about n over log n, then we can bring this down to order log n log is bring down the bottleneck in the event loop. We are throwing in extra events. We have to be a little careful that we're not throwing in too many of these extra box change events, that ends up dominating the runtime. But at least in principle, if you choose your box size carefully and balance it with respect to how quickly these are moving between boxes, you can actually get a significant asymptotic improvement here. So that's just a kind of an extra side for these models, but this sort of trick often comes up in these simulations. But like I mentioned before, this discrete event simulation is a very general kind of model. It's very useful for implementing a lot of kinds of discrete simulations. And I think this is a really nice example of it because it's a system that's not at all obvious can be represented as this kind of discrete event model. And it actually gives you a way of implementing this complicated hard sphere collision model very efficiently in practice. So any questions about any of that? Yeah.
This N over k log N over k is the average runtime.
Yeah, so if the particles weren't well mixed between the boxes, you could get local concentrations that would make this less efficient. But if we imagine that on average, we pick the number of boxes that we have about log n particles in each box, then that's what you would end up with. Okay, well, we're out of time here. If anyone hasn't brought up your homework, please bring that up, and I'll pass out the next problem set. That's